This is 15 minutes of impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast, sponsored by the Natural Gas Supply Association. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the USEA podcast series on permitting, we're going to talk with Dahvi Wilson, founder and president of Siting Clean. Dahvi is going to describe lessons learned about the best strategies for bringing utility scale clean energy projects online based on her real world experience working with project developers and local stakeholders. Dahvi's been confronting environmental issues since 1999 when she was a river trip leader in the West. She spent a decade working with organizations at the grassroots junction of politics and the environment. And in 2012, she became communications manager for Apex Clean Energy. She left in 2023 as VP of Public Affairs to found and lead Siting Clean and apply her hard-earned expertise from working at the community level on project siting and permitting. Dahvi, you've pointed out that few utility scale clean energy projects are really subjected to federal obstacles. The developers really need to address local obstacles. First key step, you've said, is understanding the political and cultural dynamics of local permitting. What does that mean? How do you deal with it?
Yeah, well, sure. Thanks again for having me. Glad to talk a little bit more about this. So, in the United States, most utility scale wind, solar, and battery storage projects are sited on private land. I think the statistic I saw recently was that I think it was up to 9% could be ultimately placed on federal land, but that right now the figure is closer to 2 to 4%.
Yeah,
And
what I've heard too.
so there's a lot of clean energy that's been built on private land. Those projects are typically built through voluntary leases with private landowners. Sometimes, they're state landowners, maybe owning school sections, but a lot of times they're just private landowners who have done some thinking about what they want to do with their land. They're often farmers, ranchers. They're often managing large tracts of land, and they've decided that they want to put clean energy on it as an additional source of revenue for them. So all these projects that are getting built on private lands have been welcomed by the landowners who have signed those leases and want to see those projects done. But in a lot of those places, in many states in the U.S., it will be their local government, their county commission, or perhaps their township association or township commission in a few states, who will have the decision-making authority over what can be built, how big it can be, where it needs to go, or whether it can be built at all. And increasingly, those local land use decisions are leading to more and more restrictions. We've seen a lot of great reporting on this in recent days, including from the Sabin Center at Columbia University, as well as Heat Map, and even USA Today has done some recent reporting on this phenomenon. And so what we see is that increasingly in these very small venues, these decision-making venues, more and more of these communities are either saying no or are creating very large delays or are creating really unworkable restrictions. And it's a pretty alarming trend that's just started to really get the attention of a much broader set of stakeholders who have an interest in seeing more clean energy built and have recently come to recognize that this local permitting barrier is quite significant and will impact our ability to deploy at scale. So that's what I've focused on. I've focused much less on federal lands, though there are unique issues on federal lands, especially now, that also make those projects quite challenging, increasingly so by the day. But most of my work has focused on those private lands projects.
And all those um, agencies, if you will, that you'd mentioned, the townships and so on, um, there's politics involved. I remember when I was covering first solar projects being built in Antelope Valley, there was a guy who wanted his land leased for a solar project, but his neighbors went to the agencies, the local agencies, very small groups, and exerted political leverage. That's what you mean when you say political and cultural dynamics, right?
Yes, that's right. So in these venues where you have often volunteer officials making very difficult decisions for their communities, they are, often not entirely prepared for the controversy that can come with these kinds of projects. And they often don't have tremendous amounts of technical expertise, and they are often searching for trusted groups that they can go to help them understand what is the right thing to do, what is true about safety and nuisance impacts, and what should I understand about the rights of my participating landowners to do what they want with their private property versus their neighbors who also claim that they should have a right to determine what happens on their neighbor's property
Well,
because it
that's
impacts them.
exactly that's
Yeah.
exactly what I wanted to ask you about next, Davi, is another key solution that you mentioned is designing and executing strategies for more and more productive community engagement. And I think that's what you were basically describing. Um, DOE a couple of years ago had this idea that there should be people who are trying to build something should come to the community with a community benefits plan to help engage them in wanting the project. But what have you found, and what do you mean about this more and more productive community engagement?
Yeah, it can mean a variety of things, and I think all of them are important. One thing it can mean is wherever possible, getting community input on what your project design is. So that is often pretty challenging for developers because they are dealing with a very challenging technical problem. They are trying to sort of optimize the design and construction of a power plant that's going to meet commercial requirements to actually be able to get built. And they have a very large number of criteria that are sort of restricting where they can put things, from physical criteria like, is this being built on a ridge line? Or like, is there wind or solar resource here?
Yeah,
To more, social restrictions, like what are the setbacks that are required by the local law from property lines, or from wetlands, or from roads. So they have all kinds of restrictions that they're trying to work within, and that's not even mentioning that they have to work on land where a landowner has leased it to them. So they have a lot of things they're trying to manage as they design a project, and it can be, because they're locked into this sort of technical analysis of how to do that effectively, it can be very hard for them to just take kind of community preference into account. However, there are ways to do that, and some developers work very hard to do that. And when they are able to find ways to integrate feedback from the community that's well founded and makes sense and realistic, that is a really valuable type of community engagement. But again, like I said, that can be hard, and often community members don't know, don't have enough information to understand which of the things they want are actually feasible. For example, it's not uncommon to have people in a community say, well, we have a great spot for your solar project. It's on that little industrial parcel over there that we've zoned industrial, and you don't have to put it on our farmland. And that sounds nice, but often if you look at that industrial parcel, it's just not suitable for this kind of project. So you can run into really well-intentioned types of feedback that actually are not feasible to incorporate. Still, it's always worth that effort. So that's one type of engagement. A second type of engagement is around community benefits. So a lot of these projects they generally create community benefits in things like tax revenues that can have huge impacts on school budgets or local services. They certainly put money into the local economy, especially during construction. But a lot of companies are also engaging in voluntary negotiations with communities about what else they might want, what kinds of additional benefits that they could, subsidize with funding usually, can help make this project feel more valuable to the members of this community. And so many companies do that. They all do it a little bit differently. It's typically kind of ad hoc, but that's another way. And the community benefit plans that DOE had introduced were requirements for companies seeking federal grants or federal loan money and some other programs. And they created a sort of a requirement for a developer to submit its concept of how its project was going to benefit the community. So that was interesting. It's not, as we see federal government cracking down on how many of those programs it has, it's maybe a little bit less relevant, but it seemed to be pretty focused on outcomes rather than process. And when I'm talking about engagement, a lot of that is process. It's like, did you ask the community what they want? And then how did you take that into account? And how does that show up in your plan? So that's community benefits. A third category would be, frankly, the politics. What's your whip count? What are your decision makers thinking? Are they going to say yes or no? And what's your strategy to help, legally and appropriately influence how they're thinking about this? What education are you doing? What organizations are you bringing in that the community will want to hear from on this issue? Who believes in advocating for it? And how do you mobilize those folks to get engaged? So that is, to me, a third bucket because it's a little more tactical. It's a little bit more about like winning a campaign. And that feels different from community engagement in the first way I described it, but all of it feels important in different places need different things. But developers have a lot of work to do on educating the community about themselves, who they are, what kind of partner they're going to be, what their project is, and then wherever possible, taking feedback.
This episode is brought to you by the Natural Gas Supply Association, a DC-based trade association that represents domestic producers and marketers of natural gas. Natural gas stands out as a fuel of choice for America's energy future. It is affordable, reliable, and sustainable. Today, natural gas powers a growing share of industrial facilities, data centers, homes, and also supports the expansion of renewable energy. The benefits of natural gas rely not only on expanding our nation's energy infrastructure, like pipelines and storage facilities, but also ensuring regulatory certainty so businesses can construct and maintain this infrastructure. The Natural Gas Supply Association advocates for permitting reform to streamline the process for approving necessary infrastructure projects without compromising environmental protections. The natural gas sector has proven itself adaptable and resilient, meeting rising demand while maintaining affordability. By investing in infrastructure, embracing permitting reform, and fostering a fact-based regulatory environment, we can ensure that natural gas continues to be a reliable foundation for America's energy future. It is our responsibility to strengthen this foundation today so that we can meet the energy demands of tomorrow. Learn more by visiting www.ngsa.org.
I want to get to that next. I just want to mention, when I was covering solar development in Antelope Valley, the project developer mentioned a lot of benefits it could provide to the community. But at one of the local meetings, the community said, "Look, we're in the desert, way away from any civic services. Can you help us get ambulance service?" They only had one ambulance that was available to come to their area. And the developer was able to arrange funding with the nearest community to provide a second ambulance service. And that was a real winning strategy at that time. But I want to get your take on another point you make in getting projects green lighted, Dahvi. You talk about navigating the ecosystem of organizations and companies working on local siting. So who are those stakeholders, the companies and organizations, and what do you mean by navigating through them?
Yeah. Well, for a long time, so I started with Apex Clean Energy, which is a US developer, builder, operator of utility scale projects. I started with them in 2012. When I started with that company, it was very small. It was about 38 people. It grew to about 450 in the years that I was there. And for many, many of those years, we were trying to figure out how to do better community engagement to get better outcomes for our projects. We were working very hard on it, and we built a pretty unique team in the industry focused on that local level work. And for many of those years, I personally and many of my colleagues were on our soapbox with anyone we could get to listen to us about this challenge, encouraging everyone to sort of up their game on this work, both in the industry and outside of the industry. And for many years, it more or less fell on deaf ears. I have a lot of theories on why that is, but at least from the external stakeholder side, a lot of it was because many of the folks most committed to these kinds of climate relevant solutions, they were focused on bigger levers. They were focused on federal policy. They were focused on incentivizing these new technologies. And they weren't focused yet on deployment, on what it's going to take to actually get the stuff built. But when the IRA passed not so long ago, a lot of those folks who had been working on those federal policies felt like they had achieved their mission, that there was now really meaningful climate policy in the United States. And they started to look at what bottleneck came next. And one of the things they started to identify was this problem. I'd say pretty consistently, we've heard there's two big barriers to deployment. The first being interconnection, transmission, all the pieces really there that are really limiting where you can put projects and get them onto the grid and how quickly. But the second big bucket was around this local siting and permitting issue, which for the first time started to get a lot of attention. And so I've noticed that in the last 2.5 years, we've really started to see growth in the number of organizations that are paying attention to this issue. In the industry, we're seeing companies start to build out teams with this kind of expertise. We've also seen a proliferation of consulting firms that can be brought on with a company to help them execute these kinds of engagement strategies on the ground. We've also seen now a number of nonprofits, and this is something I work on a lot now, who are interested in being a part of this solution of trying to get more clean energy built, but who are trying to figure out how they can effectively engage. What is the role of a nonprofit? What is the role of philanthropy? What kinds of nonprofits are needed out there to help address this problem? And so there's this growing suite of groups that are now trying to take on different pieces of this. So it's very exciting. And what I meant by navigating was, if you're sitting in a seat at a company, that means, who are my partners? Who can I work with? What is my job as the developer in this community? But also, who can I start building a relationship with who might be able to help this community understand what's in front of them in a way that they'll never trust me as the developer to do? And on the nonprofit side, navigating it means, who else is there? Is this the right place for my particular brand of support building or education? And how can I really partner up where that's appropriate with the developer to make sure that we are actually making progress on this important challenge.
Well, that comes down to the last question that I'm going to ask you, Dahvi, and it really ties into it. You talk in your fourth solution about implementing organizational designs for building public engagement teams and systems. So you have those insights that you just described, and so now how do you get messages to them? How do you get information to them? Are you talking about teams of people like boots on the ground in these communities? And as you finish up with that question, I don't want to make you go past it, but as you finish up, is there any way that some of this federal permitting reform that's being talked about in Washington, and it's going to be talked about a lot when the politicians come back from their break, can they include any of these things that you've been talking about?
Yeah, well, okay. So on the first part of that question, what that bullet refers to, and some of the materials that you've seen from me, is actually more about how do we help companies build the capacity in-house. Clean energy companies is who I really intended there. Build out the capacity to effectively do engagement work themselves and work with these nonprofit partners who are out there. And what I've found over the years is that, in my opinion, most clean energy companies do not have enough resources dedicated to this work. I think a large part of that is because many companies were built, at a time when this was perceived as a really technical problem, and they hired up really expert teams to design safe, responsible, productive, clean energy projects. But they did not build teams that were designed to take on political challenges. That
Right.
wasn't the way the industry grew. And for a long time, it didn't need those political resources. We are not in
If
that
I may,
time anymore.
yeah, if I may interject, yeah, there was a time when Tom Friedman in New York Times, he had a phrase he called said green was the new red, white, and blue, and that was true for in those days that you're describing. But as you said, it's not. We're not in those times anymore.
Sadly, no. And to be fair, it's harder now. Like we have more situations where communities are being asked to make real hard decisions about trade-offs that are not easy. So I don't want to downplay the decisions these communities are being
Yeah,
forced to make.
right.
But the companies that are developing these projects are understaffed, in my opinion, to do the kind of engagement, and for the most part, that really is needed to relationship build and build public support for each of these projects. And that same staff that doesn't exist in the companies also doesn't exist to partner with nonprofits who want to be of support. If you don't have the people who can know the projects that well, it's really hard to do this. So what that piece of work is about is trying to figure out, well, how do you start to build a case with executives in a company on how you should be scaling this kind of function to reflect today's environment? What's a responsible way to grow that, especially if you're growing it from scratch? What are some strategies that you can use to bring in third parties sometimes, and sometimes do it with your own team in the meantime? So I think that there is a lot of room for the industry to kind of come to terms with the fact that we are now operating in an environment where one of the core functions that a company needs to have is its ability to effectively work through these political processes, whether those are local or federal, as we're seeing now. So anyway, so that's what that piece is about. And on federal permitting reform,
Yeah.
um,
Can any of these things be sort of built into that kind of legislation?
um, well, federal permitting reform is typically talking about
People.
decisions that the federal government can make. And I will say, I think this administration has been very creative, more even than we expected, in finding ways to make it harder to permit, especially wind projects, but even now solar projects on private lands. I mean, so I think we were prepared for attacks on public lands. Unfortunately, they've been pretty creative in finding little federal hooks to try to make this harder everywhere. So one would think that maybe the flip is also true someday.
Yeah.
I don't think it's gonna likely happen under this administration. They've made it pretty clear what they want to do, which is, I think, kill every wind project that they can, and maybe some of the solar projects too.
Well, the first
Unfortunately,
executive order said wind and solar are not energy. It omitted
yes.
wind and solar from the list of energies.
Yes, and I saw guidance coming out of the Department of
Treasury?
Interior
Oh,
just today or yesterday, saying that intermittent sources of energy, so renewables, are not real energy, more or less.
right.
So
And
yeah, so
hold on a second. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Dahvi, but I want to say something. Even though we're going way over time, that is the wrong word to apply to wind and solar projects. For anybody that's listening, the word that applies is variable. Their quote unquote intermittency is predictable. And
yes,
so it's not unreliable, it's perfectly predictable. And that's what we do when we predict when natural gas plants are offline, or when um, nuclear plants have to go offline for maintenance, which happens frequently. That's me on my soapbox. Forgive me. Please
no,
continue.
Thank you. No, thank you for saying that. Intermittency is the word that that the Department of Interior's order is using, but I think for exactly the reasons that you implied there, because it makes something feel less reliable than it is.
Right.
So anyway, so I didn't really answer your question. I think that there's absolutely a lot that permitting reform can do for transmission projects that could be extremely beneficial and critical, and is related to this local work in that developers are limited in where they can put projects based on where there is transmission capacity available and affordable. And the more of that there is, and especially if it's in more remote areas, the less frequently these projects are going to be built in these same places where communities are already feeling the pressure. So they are related. That is absolutely something federal permitting reform could do. I don't see as many ways that it could benefit utility scale generation siting, because it would be pretty unusual. Well, you may laugh at this if you choose, but it was pretty unusual to think of the federal government reaching into private lands and telling people what they can build or not. Although now apparently we see that.
Yeah. Okay.
So maybe there's some opportunity there in the future.
I'll tell you what, let's leave it there, Dahvi. You've presented some wonderful ideas for how to deal at the local level with development. What happens in the future is going to happen in the future. November 2026 is coming. I want to thank my guest, Dahvi Wilson, founder and president of Siting Clean, for describing the lessons she has learned from real-world experience working with project developers and local stakeholders to bring energy projects online. I also want to thank our sponsor, the Natural Gas Supply Association. And as always, I want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.